Today's daf we're going to be learning is Kiddushin daf mem tet. This week's learning is sponsored by Jonathan Abel in honor of Natasha Shabbat, giving in honor of my teacher who has opened many doors of Torah for me. Okay, we're going to get started with a review of the previous Mishnah. So we had a Mishnah where a husband commits something to, right, I will betroth you with this, and then it turns out it was something else. So the Tanna Kama said this doesn't work at all. Either direction. Doesn't matter if he's giving her something better or something worse, it doesn't work. But Rabbi Shimon at the end of this Mishnah said, well, if it's something better, then it works. To which the Gemara had to figure out what exactly we're talking about here. And then Rava said, in the end, the situation is like this. The woman sent an agent to be betrothed for her and said, he's going to give you X for me, accept it on my behalf. And then it turns out he gets something else, which is better in value, but not what she told him. And then Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, oh, we don't take so seriously what she said. We take seriously that she wanted him to accept the betrothal for her, but we didn't care so much what the object was. She was just kind of saying, oh yeah, he's going to give you this, but not that I'll only be betrothed to him if he gives me that. And therefore, as long as it's an improvement, then it works. That's where we ended. And then Abaye came and said that this opinion of Rabbi Shimon, that she doesn't really, again, this is always, how seriously do we take what somebody says? Do they mean that and only that? Or could it be that, yes, part of it we take very seriously, but the other part of it is not an important detail. And she was just kind of giving him a direction of which to go in, but not necessarily that was the only way to do it. So now the fact that we can sometimes look at part of what somebody says, obviously depending on the context, and say, they didn't really mean only this, right? Because obviously any woman would be happy to get gold instead of silver, right? Again, we're talking about coins. We're not talking about jewelry. Maybe people like silver jewelry better, but we're talking about the amount of money with a higher amount of money. Obviously she'd be happier for that. And therefore Rabbi Shimon says, we don't assume that, she meant that and only that. Now we're going to have two other machlokot, two other debates in other areas, where we're going to see two other rabbis, Rabban Shimon, Gamliel and Rabbi Elazar. So Abaye basically collects. This is something that we see in a bunch of places where people will collect a bunch of different machlokot and say, oh, look, there's this debate, there's this debate, there's that debate. And all these people all side on the same side of the same debate. So Rabbi Shimon had amaram. Rabbi Shimon, that's already what we saw. Rashbag, what's his opinion? It's not get pashut edav mitocho, mikushal edav me'achorav. If you have a get, if you remember, we learned this, get pashut and get mekushal. Get pashut is where you basically write a document. Normally, the way, right, most of us don't always see divorce documents, but you might have seen, for example, ketubas. It's a much more common thing you see. How is the ketuba written? It's a document, and the witness is signed at the bottom. That's called a get pashut. It's a simple document. Get, by the way, could mean document, not necessarily a get. In this context, it's usually used for a get actually, but this could be other things as well. So edav mitocho, the edim are on the front side of the document. Mikushal, if it's a get mikushal, which we'll talk about in a minute exactly what that is, edav me'achorav. The witness is signed on the back side of the document. Now, why is this? So here's a get mikushar. If you're looking at the video, you can see. A get mikushar is a folded document. Okay, it folds like this. It's written, you write one line of text, and then you skip a line, and then you fold it. And then you write another line, and then you skip a line, and then you fold it. And then you write another line, you skip a line, and you fold it. And you keep doing that all along. And then on every fold on the back side, you have to, it's a fan fold, okay? It's folded like a fan. On every fold on the back side, since it's closed, it's then sewn together, each fold. And the witnesses sign on the back. So here, you'll have them signed on the back side. Okay, those are the witnesses' signatures. So that's a get mekushar. Why would they do this? Do you remember? They wanted to prevent Kohanim who get angry at their wives from quickly divorcing their wives. First of all, some people say that Kohanim in general were angry. They had angry nature. Or just that it's more that the ramifications were much more serious. And obviously that's the reason, even whether they were generally angry or not. But that's a better word, thank you, hot-tempered, not exactly angry, but they get angry quickly. They're hot-tempered. I hope you're not telling me that because your husband's a Kohen, but... So because they were hot-tempered, they ended up quickly divorcing their wives, and they wanted to make the process much more prolonged. Now, if you have to, every time you write a line in the get, the sofer has to then tie it then have a witness. You need more witnesses because you need a witness on every fold. You might remember all those sugiyot and gitim when we talked about that. So it's a much longer process. And then it seems like, because this seems to be talking about everyone and not just Kohanim, that over time they ended up also, in some places, they would do this for everybody because they wanted to prevent husbands from quickly divorcing their wives. So in any case, we have this case of a get pashut versus a get mekushar. Pashut shektavo edav me'ochohav, umekushar shektavo edav mitocho, shneim psulim. If you have a get, let's say the guy says, go write me a get pashut, and then the witness is signed on the backside, or a get mekushar where the witness is signed on the inside, that's no good. And if they, it basically means also if you send someone to do it this way and they do it a different way, it's no good. Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel omer mekushar shektavo edav mitocho kashel she'achol lasoto pashut. If you have one that's a tied get and the witness is signed on the inside, that's okay because you can always just straighten it out, undo the fan, and turn it into, turn it into a get pashut. In other words, a get mekushal can become a get pashut as long as you undo the folds or you don't sew them up. And therefore, if it's in that direction that he messed it up, since that one can turn into the other one, right? You can't turn a get mekushar you can't turn a pashut into a mekushar, but you can turn mekushar into a pashut. Not everyone agrees because you have these blank lines, right? It's not normal to have a line, blank line, line, blank line, line, blank line. So that's partially could be what the debate is here. And then comes Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel. He's the one who interests us because he's going to basically say, mar'eh makom hilo, right? It was just, or in this case, who? He was just kind of giving him guidelines, but he didn't really mean it had to be this way. So again, what you have is you have a man telling a scribe how to write it. If he messes it up, according to the Tanakama, if he does it differently than the way the person wanted it, doesn't work. Chanim and Gamliel says depends which direction. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says hakol kuminhag medina. Now this isn't what we're expecting to hear, but let's figure it out what this means. It goes by the custom of the place. So first of all, what does it mean, the custom of the place? We assume right now it means that if it's a city where everybody writes a get pashut, a simple one, then, and the sofer decides to write a different one, that's no good, and vice versa. But they say, they question this and say, he's obviously disagreeing with the previous Tani. Wouldn't that be obvious that everybody would agree that if this, let's say, the assumption is you didn't tell the sofer what to write. And the sofer just wrote what he wanted and wrote what was atypical for that town. Well, you have to assume that if someone didn't specify, they want what's typical in the town and not what's atypical in the town. And therefore, shouldn't everybody agree with that? So it can't possibly be that's what Rashbag is saying. But I'm Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi explains what's the machloka between them. First, he's going to say, in which cases do they not disagree? And then he's going to say, in which cases is the machloka? And then we'll understand Rashbag, and then we'll see that it's exactly as Rabbi Shimon said. If it's a place where everybody writes simple gets, they don't write this mekushar document, inami, or alternatively the opposite, which is ba'atra din he gave a mekushar ba'avad le pashut, or it's a place where everybody writes the tied document, but the sofer decided to write it pashut differently than everyone. Obviously, the husband wanted it. If the husband asked for this, right? Or let's say the husband said, I want to get pashut, and it was a place where you all do pashut, and then the sofer did it mekushar, of course that doesn't work. The machloket is a place where they do both. So either one, right? Let's say 50-50 or 40-60, doesn't really matter the percentages. And what happened? Amarle avili pashut, and the husband said, write me a get pashut, the simple one. But then the sofer went and wrote a tied one. Since, some people do this, some people do that. So Tanakama says, look, he asked for this particular one. Mar savar kapeda. He obviously intended only that particular one. You did it differently. It doesn't work. Umar savar mar ema komulo. But Rabbi Shimon said, no, since half the people do it this way, half the people do it that way. He just said, write me a get pashut, but he didn't necessarily mean it has to be pashut. He was just saying, he said, write me a get. The main thing was he wanted the get written. Which document exactly it was written on, it didn't really matter to him so much, and therefore it works. So that's how we explain Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, in which case it's the same as Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah. Rabbi Elazar ditnan, another Mishnah, and another thing about get. Haisha shamra, by the way, get pashut, some people, or it seems like, Even in other areas, sometimes people wrote a get pashut, like a document of sale or something like that. Get it, you're right. Remember, means shtar in general. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a divorce case. This would be a divorce case. If you remember in divorce, there's two types of shlichim. The husband can send a messenger to give the get to the wife, and the woman can send a messenger to collect her get. So that means that as soon as the get gets to the shaliach, the divorce is effective. It doesn't actually have to reach the woman because the shaliach, the agent, comes in place of the woman. So Rabbi Elazar brings this Mishnah, the Abaye brings this Mishnah to show Rabbi Elazar's position that he also says the same thing. She says, go get me a get from a particular place. Now, is she the one to decide which place the husband's going to decide to give her the get? Not really, right? So that's partly why there's an issue here. She's basically saying, go get my get from here. And the shaliach went, but maybe didn't find the husband there or his messenger and went and found the husband somewhere else, or the husband bumps into him on the way and gives him the get. He ends up, for some reason, getting the get from somewhere else. Pasul doesn't work according to Tanakama because he didn't follow her orders. She said, get the get from there, and he didn't. But Rabbi Elazar, you can already know where he's going. Machshir, he says, this get works totally fine. Alma kasavar marema komilo. So again, what do you see? She's just saying, I think that's where he's going to bring it to you, but it doesn't really matter where he gets it from, according to Rabbi Elazar, because again, we don't take this part of her words so seriously. Obviously, you can see why it's a little bit dangerous to say this, because when do we determine that these words are the ones that are critical and when do we not? Obviously, the Rabbi Shimon, Gamliel, and Rabbi Elazar are all using common sense about what, in the end, she really just wants to get. In the end, she wants to be betrothed. And if she's getting more money, what's the difference, right? If it's her benefit. Now, Amar Ula. And again, because we're getting into the woman's mind, it's very interesting daf, because this whole daf, really, a lot of the daf is going to be talking about what's in someone's mind. What are they thinking, right? What are the expectations? So Amar Ula, machloket b'shevach mamon. This, by the way, which we saw, is about if she's getting something of higher value financially. Aval b'shevach yuchasin divrei kol einam mekudeshet. But when it comes to, he says, I'm a Levi, and it turns out he was a Kohen. Okay? Or he says, we're going to see in the next Mishnah, I'm a Mamzer, and it turns out a Natin. Or something where, or a Yisrael, and he's a Levi. Where it means he has a higher status in the community. Okay? Whatever that might, however we define status, and there's a hierarchy. If it's a higher status thing, then we don't assume she was Marelo Makom. Okay? Now, if he says, I'm betrothing you on the condition that I am a Levi, and it turns out he was a Kohen, the wedding is off. Okay, this is not a betrothal. Why not? There's a great line. My taima, misani derav mikari lo beina. I don't want shoes that are greater than the size of my foot. And that means that not every woman wants to go into a marriage where the yichus is better than where she's coming from. Or even maybe she's at that yichus, but maybe she doesn't want to be in that social standing. It's sometimes pressure to be in a higher social standing. People are looking at you, people have expectations of you, whatever reason it might be, it's not always good to go up in status. And she might say, that's not what I wanted. You told me you were something. I married you thinking you were something. Now you're in, a different place. And that's not where I want to be. I don't want to be in that place in society. And again, you have to think about it. It's very hard for us to fathom because the truth is maybe it's not so hard, but whether it's socioeconomic status, whether it's right there, it's hard for us to assume, what's the difference between being a Kohen, a Levi, Yisrael, those kind of statuses, because we don't, other than, Kohanim have a certain role and the Levim wash their hands, but other than that, we don't really view ourselves living in some hierarchy of you're in a higher status than me. But we do have statuses that are different in terms of we have, whether it's socioeconomic or whether it's political, or, I could easily see someone saying, I don't want to be married to a politician, right? That seems something I could imagine, right? So there's certain areas where we're like, that's not what I bargained for, right? That's more than I bargained for. Not interested in that. So therefore, Yuchsin, this is not an issue. What's the structure for what we're going to have right now? It's very simple structure. We're going to have a braita to prove this limitation of Ula, that it's only in money. But Rabbi Shimon says it's not in Yuchsin. And number two, we're going to bring proof from our Mishnayot. Our Mishnah connected with the next Mishnah. Then we're going to bring a question on the proof from our Mishnah. We're going to try to infer it from the Mishnayot here. We're going to bring a question against that and bring two answers. That's this section for now. So Tanya Namihachi, first part braita to support. Rabbi Shimon So here it says it explicitly in the braita exactly what Ula said, which is Rabbi Shimon said, right? He agrees that if he fooled her or tricked her into believing he had a different yichus, and it turns out it was a higher yichus, she's not mekudeshet. Okay, it doesn't work. Rav Ashi, nami daika. So Rav Ashi says the Mishnah further proves this. Why? So this exact case comes up in the next Mishnah. We'll see it at the end of our daf. On the condition that I'm a Kohen, and it turns out he was a Levi, or Levi v'nimtza Kohen, or he said on condition I'm a Levi, and it turns out he was a Kohen. Natin v'nimtza mamzer, mamzer v'nimtza natin. Okay, if he said I was a natin, remember those are the people from the time of Yoshua who basically pretended they weren't from the 7 nations, that we were supposed to wipe out all the inhabitants. They pretended they came from far. He made a pact with them, then we couldn't destroy them, but they ended up becoming our water drawer bearers and wood choppers, and they pseudo convert to Judaism according to some opinions, but they're not really Jews. We can't marry them. Okay, so anyway, Natin, and it turns out it was a mamzer. Mamzer was a Natin, so a different category. Below palig Rabbi Shimon, and he doesn't disagree in that Mishnah. Okay, so now we're going to prove from what it doesn't say in the Mishnah. Right, our Mishnah says there's a machloket. The next Mishnah says there's no machloket. Proof. There's no machloket. If there was a machloket, it would have said at the end of that Mishnah, Rabbi Shimon disagrees. So what do you see? They don't argue about difference in yuchsin. Right? He would have said if it's a higher status, then it would work, and he doesn't say that. That seems pretty simple. However, his son Mar bar Rav Ashi comes and questions his father. Matkivla Mar bar Rav Ashi. But look at the continuation of that Mishnah. And it says, Ela de katane al menat sheyesh li bat o shivcha megudelet ve'en lo, al menat she'en lo ve'yesh lo, de shevach mamonu, hachinami de lo palik. Okay, but wait, it says there, in the continuation of the cases, it says, he promises her that I have a daughter or a maidservant who's migudelet. What does migudelet mean? So right now we're going to assume it means who's old enough to work, basically, which means that, remember the Mishnah too about the famous Mishnah of how many shvachot they have and what that means. If there's 1, 2, 3, or 4, the woman can lower her level of working, right? She doesn't have to do, the woman in those days was responsible to do certain household chores, and the more shvachot he had, or if she brought shvachot with her, she would have less work to do in the house until we get to the stage where she has no work. And then they say, well, that's not good either. It's going to lead her to all sorts of promiscuous behavior because she'll have nothing to do with her life. So she has to do a little bit of work so she doesn't just sit there idly doing nothing, which then might cause her to do other things. Anyway, in which case we say, if he says I'm bringing in either I have an older daughter or I have an older maidservant who can do some of the work, that is a financial benefit for the woman. Now, whether it's actually financial, she sees money, but it's something that's better for her in a financial realm because she'll have less work to do for the house, which might mean she could go work and do other things to make money doing other things with her time. So if he says that to her and he doesn't, or the reverse, he says he doesn't have it and he does, which is, this would be a shevach mamon case. Now, if you just said, Ula, that when it comes to shevach mamon and it's good for her, right? Let's say he says, I don't have, and he does. Well, then it's obviously going to work according to Rabbi Shimon. But, right, so hachanami de lo pali, you're going to say they don't argue. Of course they argue there, because just like they argue in our Mishnah, they argue there. However, your whole proof was it doesn't say Rabbi Shimon disagrees. But Rabbi Shimon, so now let's just call it A, B, and C. A is our Mishnah, Shevach Mamon. B is the next few lines in the Mishnah and the next Mishnah, which is Levi, Kohen, Kohen, Levi, which is Yuchsin. C, which comes right after that, is the Shivcha and the daughter, who are Megudalot, right? They're older. So now, which is, we assume right now, a Mamon issue. If it's a Mamon issue, well, then we already said they argue about it, even though it doesn't say that Rabbi Shimon disagrees. So Ella Palik Beresha V'Uadin L'Seifa. So obviously in A, they argue that it says. And even though it doesn't say it in C, obviously they argue in C because it's a monetary issue. So obviously Rabbi Shimon would think that this works. Hachanami, likewise, Palik Beresha V'Uadin L'Seifa. Well, just like you say, they argue in A and they also argue in C, even though it doesn't say so. Well, then what, you're going to skip B? Obviously they argue in A, B, and C. And then your proof is not a good proof because you could say that Rabbi Shimon argues in Yuchsin. Okay, so the fact that Rabbi Shimon is missing in the next Mishnah doesn't mean he doesn't argue, because it could be we just take Rabbi Shimon in our Mishnah and apply it to B and C, because we know it applies to C and therefore it also applies to B. How do we know it applies to C? Because C is the same topic as our Mishnah, Shevach Mamon. To which we're going to have two possible answers here. Hachi hashta, hatem v'idi v'idi shabach mamon, palig beresha v'odim b'seifa, hachad shabach yuchsin hu amita de palig nitne. The first answer is going to basically say this whole theory that if they argue in A and they argue in C, and it doesn't say they argue in C, but they do, then obviously they also argue in B. Now it's going to say, what do you mean? They didn't need to say they argue in C. Why not? Because it was obvious. Because if you know they argue in Shevach Mamon, then they obviously argue in C as well, and there was no need to say it. But Shevach Yuchsin is something totally different. And if they really argued, then it should have said it in the Mishnah. The fact that it doesn't say it in the Mishnah proves that they argue. So basically, we're going to say A and C, they obviously argue. C, there was no need to put it in there. That's why they didn't put it in, because it was obvious. B is a whole different beast, and therefore it didn't say anything, and therefore they obviously don't argue, because if they would have argued, it had to have mentioned it. So that's the first proof. The second proof is to say, who's to say C is Shevach Mamon? Maybe you didn't understand C at all. So the first is the theory about how we got to the whole, it knocked out the theory of how we assumed that the fact that it's missing means they don't argue. But now, right, we're going to, in other words, the fact that it's missing in C and they do argue means that the fact that it's missing in B means they also are, right, that they would argue, but it knocks out that whole approach that, no, maybe we can distinguish. This one basically says you misunderstood what gadelet is. We thought gadelet means she's older. Now we're going to say gadelet means something else based on places where we've seen this before. And a lot of today is really defining terms. So now they say maybe also it's true for Shevach Yuchsin, meaning maybe also C is a case of Shevach Yuchsin, which by the way would make sense. Why would you go from Mammon to Yuchsin to Mammon, right, in terms of the order of the Mishnah? They're going to say that case of the Shikha and the daughter is actually Yuchsin. Why Yuchsin? Not exactly what we thought. And this is maybe goes back to what I said before, that we have different social statuses. Also, they did. It wasn't only Kohen Levi and all that. Who's to say Megudelet means that she is of age, older? My Megudelet, Gadelet. What it means is Gadelet. What's Gadelet? You might remember. So first of all, Gadelet could just be important. That's how Rashi explains it. Chashuva. Remember, we learned by Pesachim, there was the Isha Chashuva. She has a different status. She actually leans at the table for the Heseba. That's Seder night. But also, the Rabbeinu Hananel, and Tosfa quotes him, says that Gadelet, from, if you remember, there was that Miriam Megadla Se'al Neshaya, she would plait the hair of the women, and the Gadel Se'ar was to do the hairdos of women. And that was considered, interesting, right? A higher, according to Rabbeinu Hananel, anyway, a higher status thing. Why was it considered higher status? So the commentaries say both Isha Chashuva and perhaps this woman who does the hair. So what do we know about hairdressers? Maybe this will connect with something we'll see later in today's talk, right? They talk to everybody. They talk to all the women. And because they talk to all the women, you have to make this connection, people listen to them. And that makes them important, okay? They have prominence in the community because they talk to all the women and people listen to what they say. So whether you say it's an Isha Chashuva, that people come and listen to her because they respect and admire her, or because she's the hairdresser and goes around to everybody's house and talks to people and people listen to her. Okay, so that's two different ways of understanding it. Now, if that's the case, why does Rabbi Shimon not agree here that, right, maybe it's always better to go up in status? Well, the Amra hi lo nichale, she could say, I'm not excited that you have this either, right? I think it's funny if you think about the hairdresser image, but this hairdresser in the house, or perhaps an Isha Chashuva, both of them people who talk to a lot of other women, because what's the concern? This woman will take my words and pass it on to other people. She'll talk about me because she'll know all these things about me, and she'll talk to everybody else, and she'll end up telling them all sorts of things about me that I don't want people to know. So she might say, this isn't a good thing for me to go up in status, the fact that you have this, daughter or shivcha who's basically talking to everybody in town, because I don't want people to be talking about me, and she'll just, air my dirty laundry out there. So that's an interesting cultural, again, the commentaries, the fact that it's either an Isha Chashuva or a hairdresser are very interesting in my mind. Tanu Rabbanan. More things now he's going to promise. Amanat Sharni Karyana. I read the Torah. Now, if someone says I read the Torah, how do we judge this? What kind of reading the Torah? Let's say he says I read the Torah, and then she takes out a tikkun, and he can't make heads or tails of anything. She's like, what do you mean you read the Torah? You don't read the Torah. So how much Torah does he need to be able to read? So, if there's 3 psukim he knows how to read, how to learn, that's enough, because that's a minimum amount of reading the Torah. So now we have, according to this, he can read 3 psukim, right? He knows some of his bar mitzvah parsha by heart. Okay, that works. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, it's not enough that he read. He has to translate the psukim, know how to translate them. So the Gemara says, now, why translate? This isn't like, okay, you just have to understand what you mean. In those days, remember, and we've talked about this, and also in many communities, they do this today. They would read the Torah, and after every pasuk they would read, they would add I should say very carefully, an interpretation of the pasuk, a targum. So they would read the pasuk and say the targum. Nowadays, they read unkelus. They read the targum unkelus in many communities. You read a pasuk, and then you read the targum. So right now, it seems he has to know how to read and he has to know how to understand it in order to say the Targum. So the Gemara says, Yitargei midate is going to translate it according to his own interpretation. V'hatanya, it says in a braita, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Mitagem pasuk kitzurato harei ze badai. If you do translate the pasuk in your own interpretation, that's a badai. Badai is someone who makes things up. Like, you're not allowed to do that. You can't just make up your own. We all know how complicated psukim are in the Torah. When you're doing the Targum we don't just allow every Joe Schmo to translate the Torah as he likes. And if you're going to add anything to the pasuk, all the more so. You're basically using God's name in vain, kind of thing. You know, you're cursing. I forget the word. I can't think of the translation. Someone can help me. I don't know why I'm blanking on the word, but it's blasphemy. Thank you. So the word can come to me. Ella, my targum. So what is targum here? Targum didan, it's whatever translation they use then. It could be it was onkelos, some people say. It could be it was some other translation. It was more of a known translation. So you'd have to know, number one, how to read, like with the trop and with the vowels, which don't appear in the Sefer Torah, and with the Targum that was known in those days. That's enough. 3 psukim, that's all you need to know. But hani mile da amar la karyana. Now we're going to talk about language. If he said, I'm a karyana, that language of the word, I read the Torah, let's say in our language, we would say, I can read the Torah. I can read the Torah means I can read a few psukim. Aval amar la, ana, kara ana. But if he says, I am a reader, like we'd say now, a Baal Koreh, we call it. I'm a Baal Koreh. That's something different. Then, here's a high standard. Adikare, or write to Nevi Uktuve B'diuka. You have to read Torah, Nevi'im, Uktuvim, perfectly. Okay? So depending on what language he uses, now we're going to check, was he really telling the truth or not? And we see depending on what he used. Same thing with the next language. Almanachani shoneh. He says, I learn. I'm a learner. Okay, what does it mean I'm a learner? Right? Do you daf Yomi? How well can you pass a quiz? Right? How we define it. The other question is, what does shoneh mean? Do you learn Torah? Do you learn Mishna? Do you learn Gemara? What does that mean? Right? Many people learn, but they learn different things. Chizki amar halachot. This means halachot, which Rashi says halacha l'Moshe Sinai. It means you know a lot of halacha l'Moshe Sinai. Rabbi Yochanan amar Torah. He says it means you learn Torah. To which the Gemara says meitive. Wait, something doesn't make sense here because it's a different braita that says ezum hi Mishnah. When we say Mishnah, what do we mean by Mishnah? Rabbi Meir omer halachot. That fits with Chizkiah. Rabbi Yehuda omer midrash. Rabbi Yehuda says midrash. Now Rabbi Yochanan doesn't fit with either one. What's midrash? So Gemara says, my Torah, midrash Torah. What do you mean? What do you think midrash is? Okay, turning now to Amud Bet. Midrash doesn't mean, when we said Torah, it doesn't mean Torah. It means the midrash halacha, which is, it's like the Mishnah, where they give you these halachot, Tanaitic time period, but the Mishnah doesn't connect it to the psukim. The midrash, which is not midrash like when we think of midrash and stories, it's not the stories. It's the midrash halacha that we see all the time quoted in the Gemara, where they say, you might have thought this from the pasuk, but it says this, that comes to teach you, blah, blah, blah. So that's a midrash halacha, and we call that Torah. When he said, I'm shoneh, and shoneh means Torah, it means he knows the drashot on the Torah that get you to the halacha. So anyway, 2 interpretations what shoneh means. But hanimile de amar la tanina. That's if you use the language tanina, which comes from shoneh and shin and taf switch in Aramaic. So tanina is shanina, which means, okay, I learn. But aval amar la tana ana. But if he says I'm a tana, now what could it possibly mean? I'm a tana. A tana usually means I live in the time period of the Tanaim. Now we're talking time of Amoraim. You're not saying I lived 200 years ago or 100 years ago. So what does it mean? I'm a tana. If you might remember, we see this a lot in the Gemara where it says Tana Tane Kamede, right? A Tana brought a braita in front of this rabbi. Now, he wasn't a Tana because it was bringing it in front of an Amora. There were people in the community known as, they were called the Tanaim, who basically repeated and recited all the braitot, all the midrash halacha, they knew everything. So if he says Tana Ana, just like Kara Ana meant, I really know how to read, I'm the guy who knows all the Tanaitic material. So Aditane Hilchata Sifra, V'Sifra, V'Tosefta. He needs to know the halachot. He needs to know, right, that's halachot mishmisinai. He needs to know the Sifra and the Sifra, which are the midrash halacha and Vayikra and Bamidbar and Dvarim, and the Tosefta. It's interesting, it doesn't say Mechilta, which was on Shmot, but obviously it includes that as well. He needs to know all that type of literature. Okay, the Tosefta, which was the parallel to the Mishnah, the Rabbi Chia put together instead of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. Almanachani Talmid. Now, from here, we're going to add some other things which are going to lead us to get sidetracked. Almanachani Talmid, Enomrim Kashima ben Azai, Kashima ben Zoma. If you say, I'm a student, what does the student mean? Okay, does student mean you're the top student in the class? Does it mean you don't understand anything you're learning, you just happen to sit in class? Right? What does it mean? So we don't say like Shimon ben Azai and Shimon ben Zoma. Now, why are they called Talmidim? They never got smicha. Otherwise, they'd be in the category of a chacham or a rav. But Ben Zoma and Ben Azai, we know we're very, very smart. So you don't have to be the best student in the class, okay? You don't have to be at the top of the top like Ben Zoma and Ben Azai. But it's if somebody asks you a question about something you're learning. We've seen this before, the distinction between someone asking you something you're learning and something you're not learning. If they ask you a question on something that you're learning, even if it's easy material, like Masechet Kala, which doesn't even have a Gemara on it, so it's much easier material, even if you say it about that, there's all these like small Masechtot, one of them is Masechet Kala, there's all sorts of ones like that, but anyway, we're not going to get into that right now. If you're able to answer a question about something you're learning, then we call you a Talmid. Almanat Shani Chacham. So now, how big a Chacham do you need to be? Not like the rabbis of Yavne, right? Remember, that's where the Sanhedrin went right after the the destruction, or like Rabbi Akiva and his friends. It means someone can ask you about anything. A dvar chokhmah, some people say dvar chokhmah is something not by tradition, something you can think about, okay, like a logical question, and you have an answer to it, then you can be a chacham. Then we basically assume, okay, you passed the test, you said you're a chacham, you're clearly a chacham, you're betrothed. Amanat shani gibor. Now we're moving out of the Torah world into I'm a warrior, I'm strong. Right? In the time of David, these were the heads of the army. It's that their people are scared of them because they look at them as that's a strong person. Okay. I don't know, scared is the word, but there's fear. I'm wealthy. So they keep picking the people we know the most to be the wealthy people. So Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah is known in the famous story with Rabban Gamliel and Rabbi Yeshua and Brachot, where Rabban Gamliel gets kicked out and they look for a replacement and they try to find someone who has everything. He has Zchut Avod, his fathers were in the right way, right? They were learners also. He's wealthy. Okay, so the wealthy person, they wanted wealth, that was Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Charson comes up in another famous story. Remember the Hillel story, where Hillel is, right, he wants to learn Torah, and what does he do? They don't let him in the Beit Midrash. He doesn't have money that day, right? He would go to the Beit Midrash every day to learn. He had no money. So there's this Gemara in Yomi, which says, when you get up to heaven and they say you didn't learn Torah, and you say, well, I was poor. Well, were you as poor as Hillel? And look, he managed to learn Torah where he went through the sky roof, right? And he almost, what do you call it, the skylight. He looked in and tried to learn and almost froze to death. And then they say, if you say I was too rich and had to deal with all my business, this is a less known story, but also a very interesting one. I was so rich, I couldn't make time. Were you as rich as Rabbi Elazar ben Charson, he inherited tons of cities and he owned a ton of wealth, and yet he went to learn Torah every day in different places. Supposed to learn always in the same place. Anyway, it's a good story there. And so anyway, he was known to be very, very wealthy. Okay, the story goes on that he gets drafted then to go work for himself, and then they don't realize that he is Rabbi Elazar ben Charson because they don't recognize the boss because he was so busy learning, he wasn't part of his business stuff. So what's the definition of wealth? You don't have to be that wealthy, but if people respect you because of your wealth. So you see even there, social, right? Socioeconomic was also a part in status there. This is a fascinating one. He says, I'm marrying you and promising you I'm a tzaddik, and then it turns out she finds out he was a Rasha Gamur. Okay? She's still Mekudeshet. Now, in this case, the commentaries say only out of suffix. She's not definitely betrothed. But what's the concern? We don't know what's going on in his mind. Maybe he decided to do tshuva. Maybe he's a good person now. We don't really know. But therefore, if he promised, and there's reason to believe because he promised, he said on the condition, I'm a tzaddik, and we assume he wanted the betrothal to go through. So therefore, we assume he wasn't lying. So that's enough to say that if she wants to go marry someone else, she has to get a divorce from him, because it could be she's actually betrothed to him, because we don't really know. This is all what we call dvarim shabalev, which is actually going to be the lead into the next sugya. Almanat she'ani rasha. If you say, he says, I'm betrothing you, and I'm promising you that I'm a bad person, even if he's a real tzaddik, she's betrothed, because maybe he actually had thoughts to worship idols, which that in of itself makes you a rasha, and therefore, since also it's something taloi in his mind, we don't really know, so because of that, you have to be concerned. Okay, from this, we're going to get on a total sidetrack, and this is a very, I don't know what to do with these. You always have to wonder what exactly are the rabbis trying to get at here. But since we started talking about who is the best, the smartest, and who is the this, now we're going to learn that we're going to have a slew of statements. 10 kabim is a measure, a kav. If you remember, we talked about that a lot. 10 kav of this came down to the world. 9 of them went here, and only 1 was distributed evenly among the rest of the world. So, or maybe unevenly, it doesn't really say. But the idea, the way I see this, is they're basically trying to say, this place is known for X, and this place is known for Y, and this place is known for Z, and they're saying it in this phrase. Some of these you're sure you've heard before. 10 measures of wisdom came down to the world. 9 were by Israel, and 1 in the rest of the world, right? This is saying the Talmidei Chachamim are from Israel. 10 measures of beauty came to the world. 9 of them went to Jerusalem, and 1 the rest of the world. Right? Again, I don't think these things were meant to be absolute truths, right? We know there's gorgeous places in the world, but what it's trying to say is, there's something unique about the beauty of Jerusalem. 10 measures of wealth. 9 got to Rome. We actually saw a story about this, about how they got the wealth they came from Egypt, that Joseph took. There's some story we saw. Anyway, that it supports this reading, that Rome had, a lot of the wealth. It also made sense in those days to say that. Poverty, the opposite of that, where the Tish'an Atla Bavel. Bavel, they say, was a place with a lot of poverty. This Gemara in general is an anti-Babylonian Gemara. Okay, it's putting Israel, the Chachamim were all in Israel, not in Babylonia. And, right, because remember, also in Babylonia, that's where the center moved, but in Israel, they were trying to kind of keep a stronghold there. So it could be also something of that is going on here. So Bavel is a place of poverty. So 9 by Babylonia took the rest. Arrogance. Tish'an Atla Elam, which is in Persia of those days, which is now in Iran, southwest Iran. Okay, the rest first. So they have the arrogance. So the Gemara stops for a minute and says, wait a minute. Wait, isn't Bavel, Babylonia, known for their arrogance? Don't we have a pasuk from Zechariah, which is understood to be talking about arrogance? So a vision that Zechariah sees. These 2 women come down flying. Okay, it's obviously a vision, and they have their wings with something like a spirit in their wings. And they have wings like the wings of a stork. And they're carrying some measure of something between heaven and earth. And I said to the angel who was speaking to me, where are they bringing this measure of whatever they have? They're bringing it to Eretz Shinar, which is Babylonia, to build a house there. Now notice it turns to singular. There's two of them, but then it says livnot labayit, which is only one of them. So Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabbi Yochanan explains this. Pasuk zoch chanufa u'bisut haruach she'yodil Babel. Who are the two women? They're flattery and arrogance. So it sounds like they went down to Babylonia because it says to build a house in Babylonia. In V'hachinachi, you're right. It did land in Babylonia. And then it slowly moved to, good, she landed there, but then she moved it over to Elam. You can also infer that from the pasuk livnot labayit, which means one of them built a house there, the other one took the majority of it with her, brought it to Elam. Shma mina. So that you can infer from here, to which they say, wait a minute, we have another problem with this. You can see that they're really trying to show that arrogance was prevalent in Babylonia, which again shows that this is a very anti-Babylonian text. But don't they say also what causes gasut ruach, arrogance? Poverty. So poverty, we already said, went to Babylonia, and poverty goes together with arrogance. So shouldn't the arrogance be in Babylonia? So they say no, there's two types of poverty. My aniyut de Torah. The poverty we were talking about in Babylonia was poverty of wealth. Okay, they were very poor. But the poverty that leads to gasut ruach, which was in Elam in the end, was actually, and maybe this is like the anti-Babylonian, okay, these are the people who oh no, Babylonia is not the worst, because it's aniyut of Torah, there was poverty of Torah, and that's what leads to arrogance. If you don't know Torah, then it leads to arrogance. There's a famous pasuk in Shiur Shirim, we have a younger sister and she doesn't have breasts. This is a reference, an allegory to Elam, which had people learning there, but nobody was teaching there. In other words, that's missing something very basic. So she has breasts, but they're not developed. They have Torah, but it's not being taught to other people. Okay, back to our topic, the asara, the 10 things. Asara kabin gvura yardu la'olam, tishanatlu parsiim. The parsiim, I guess, were known for their strength. Asara kabin kinim yardu la'olam. Lice. We're talking about all different things here. Tishanatla madai. Okay, apparently there was a lice epidemic there. Asara kabin shafim yardu la'olam. Who has the magic? We know this from the Torah, but the Khartoumim of the Egyptians. Tishanatla Mitzrayim, from the story of Paro and Mitzrayim and Jews. Right, and Moshe Rabbeinu. Asara kabim nigaim yardu la'olam. Okay, leprosy. Tishanatlu chazirim. Apparently, this was common among pigs to have leprosy. Asara kabim znut yardu la'olam. Tishanat la'aravia. They were known for their promiscuous relationships. Asara kabin azut yardu la'olam, which Rashi translates as mamzerim. Tishanat la'meshani. Proves there's a Gemara that talks about in Mishnah there were a lot of mamzerim. Asara kabin. This is a good one. You ready for this? Sicha yardu la'olam. Okay. Conversations. Tish'a natlu nashim. Women are the ones who talk a lot more than the men. So women got most of the talking capabilities. Interesting statement. Asara kabin shichrut yardu la'olam. Tisha. This, by the way, connects with the hairdresser and the chatting and the chit chat and all that. I don't think they mean by speakers, but I think they mean chit chat and that kind of conversation. It's a bit of a derogatory term. Asara kabin shichrut yardu la'olam. Drunkenness. Tisha natlu kushim. Asara kabin shenan yardu la'olam, tishanatlu avadim. Okay, so the kushim got the drunks, the people who sleep a lot are the avadim, slaves. Chanatlu kol olam kula. Okay, that's the end of that. Those interesting slew of cases. What to do with them is definitely a good question. Why it's here, I don't really know, but it does sort of show you again this different society norms and hierarchies and what people thought of other people, right? Which is all about what societal hierarchies are all about. Okay, moving to the next Mishnah. We saw this before, it was quoted by the Gemara, now it's in the Mishnah. I'm a Kohen, and it turns out he was a Levi. Levi, Kohen, Natim, Mamzer. Ben Ir v'nimtzak ben Krach, said I'm a city boy, and it turns out he was from the village. This reminds me of the two mice, right? The story, I forget what it's called, but the mouse who lives in the country and the mouse who lives in the city, and each one goes to live in the other place and can't survive there. So you could see this, right? I'm a city boy, and it turns out he was a village boy. Ben Krach ben Imtza ben Ir. There he was a village boy, but it turns out he was a city boy. I promised my house is near the bathhouse, and it actually wasn't. Thank you, Caroline. The Town Mouse and the Country Mouse, one of my favorite books when I was growing up. Okay, it's far from the bathhouse. It turns out it was near. All I can think about here is you have the seat on the plane right next to the bathroom, right? It's not necessarily a good seat. And again, it's the same reason. I mean, there on the plane, it's because it's very noisy, but in the community, everybody's passing by you all the time. You have a lot less privacy. On the other hand, it's close, it's convenient if you have to go to the bathroom a lot, right? Or in this house, it's not the bathroom, it's to wash, it's very convenient. You have to go to the bathhouse, so whenever you want, it's very convenient. That case we discussed. I have sons and I don't have sons, and it turns out he did. Or or I have, but he didn't have. And in all of them, even if she says, oh, yeah, I didn't say anything, but I didn't really care about that, doesn't work. And the same thing, by the way, in the reverse. Okay, if she promised him something and it wasn't true, all this would be the same. It doesn't matter which direction. Okay, this thing is very important line, even though she thought it in her heart, doesn't matter. Even though she thought, I don't really care about this, still, we're not going to say if she didn't express it. Okay, this is the basis for what we're going to talk about tomorrow. Things that you don't express, that are in your heart, are not anything. Where you get to one of very, very, very famous Gemara. Also, already today we saw a bunch of things, but this is a really famous story that someone will stop here, but we'll start with this tomorrow because it's a big case. I don't want to just end with it in the last minute of class. But a guy who sells his property to go on Aliyah, and then he ends up not being able to go on Aliyah, and then he wants to get his house back. He's like, what do you mean? Of course, I was planning to make Aliyah, and of course, this didn't work out. I want to be without a house. I really didn't mean to sell it to you, but my Aliyah wasn't going to work out. So we'll get to that story tomorrow. Very famous story, and that's it for today. Wishing everybody a Madim L'Simcha, enjoyable Chag, and meet up tomorrow. So in terms of Zoom, I mentioned in class yesterday, we're not going to have Zoom on Friday. It's the only day we won't have Zoom. So the classes will go up on Thursday already, so you can get ahead. Okay, bye.